Okay. In this presentation, I'll be basing my presentation on findings that we undertook as UN Women in collaboration with the Government of Kenya, that is the National AIDS Control Council, and the Network of Women Living with HIV, as well as the men living with HIV. And what I'll be presenting is basic, what are some of the challenges that we face in Kenya, what are some of the recommendations, some of which are being implemented currently, and some of which the government is just about to undertake and implement. But before I start off, I know most of the speakers who talked before me have already addressed this, but I'd just like us to reflect a little bit around gender-based violence and violence against women, and just go through some of the definitions that we all know as experts in this field around the same. What is GBV? GBV is any form of violence that establishes, maintains, or attempts to reassert unequal power relations among whichever form of gender. What is violence against women and girls? That would be any form of gender-based violence that results to, or that is likely to result in harming women and girls. Gender-based violence in Kenya has continued to be on the rise. Violence against women and girls as well. And we know they're both cause and consequence of HIV. In Kenya right now, my colleague Njoki already talked about the sterilization of women living with HIV, but another big issue that we are facing right now is female genital mutilation. But as a government, we are happy to announce that we have an anti-FGM board in place that is part of our constitution, and that has actually advanced issues around fighting against female genital mutilation. We must also say cases of rape are very high in Kenya. Right now we have survivors between the age of 0 to 5, all the way until only 11 years old. So these are very young girls who should otherwise be in school, but are actually grappling around issues of rape, and are made even at the age of 2 to go through effects of rape. I've already gone through that slide. I'll jump a little bit. Then when we come to Kenya, we also realize, we all know in 0708, after the elections, we underwent a whole time of violence and conflict. As a result of the electoral conflicts, there was a lot of gender-based violence among the women and girls. And one of the challenges that happened during this time to those who are accessing HIV care, prevention, and support services, because of the disruption, and we had to move physically from one area to another, those disruption of services. There's also disruption of, we also realized there's a very low follow-up on treatment if you move from one center to another, because how we are structured in Kenya, if you're accessing drugs from point A, then that becomes your point of getting the drugs, and it was a bit difficult for them to get drugs everywhere, and we had quite a number of HIV positive people lost to follow-up just due to the disruptions. Since then, we thank the Lord, the next elections were not that disruptive, but as a result of that, UN Women and partners have developed a toolkit to respond to any form of electoral gender-based violence, and that toolkit is available. We have shared it with the government, and they have willingly accepted it. We've also, I won't go through what we've been able to do, but I'll jump a little bit and go to what are some of the key challenges and gaps that we've been facing as we talk about violence within the context of any form of emergency or conflict and culture. One challenge we've been facing is at community level. What we find, usually we have late reporting of cases. Sometimes the late reporting is just because people don't know. Another challenge with the late reporting is sometimes, as my colleagues have said, when you go to report to the police, they first point at your fault as a woman. Why, how did you end up, or as a man, how did you end up being raped? So because of that shame, the same people who is supposed to protect you are exposing you to, you lay back. We've had some cases where the same policemen that you're supposed to go to are the same ones who are the perpetrators of such crime. Our traditional justice system was previously not empowered, but as we move along, we'll be able to see our new constitution has actually passed and commissioned the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms at community level, and those are now functional. As I mentioned before, we have the disruption of services, and also now a challenge at community level is the reintegration of the survivors back to society. Once they come back, are they able to continue with their life as usual? It's hard, but also does the community accept them back at that point? Another challenge we have is around the legal justice systems. I think if you've been following the media, our Chief Justice has been talking about how he needs to strengthen. So the long pending cases are quickly resolved, and that has really made women and boys and men get discouraged in following through any cases. In Kenya, rape is a bailable offense, and the bail is not set. It depends on the magistrate. So that is a really big challenge. The current bail is almost down to $100, $1,000, which is easily affordable if you're keen to get yourself out of that mess. So that's another challenge. As I mentioned, sometimes the police deter survivors. We also have a slight challenge on the collection of evidence and utilization of the evidence, but we will see what we're doing around that. In many of the places, and then what our studies showed is that many of the places with high HIV prevalence also have high incidences of GBV. Unfortunately, we have very few protection centers within these areas where survivors can go and have some shelter, both young, adolescents, and older survivors. So that's also a challenge we have in Kenya. When we look at our health facilities, sometimes the burden on the healthcare setting is too much. When you present with an issue around GBV, well, we have a few one-stop centers, gender violence recovery centers in a few healthcare settings. This is not always possible because what happens is we find the staff in charge of the gender violence recovery center is the same staff in charge of the outpatient clinics. So because of the weight, the outpatient clinics have more people, they end up leaving the gender-based violence center unmanned. So what happens, if I go there with a case, I won't be attended to. So 72 hours pass, have I gotten my PEP on time? All that is a challenge that including the gender violence recovery centers have identified as challenges to them. So as I go back, what are some of the things we have been doing as a government and with development partners, including UN Women? One thing we've been doing is trainings, and how our trainings are structured. We started off with the police. We also include the justice system, the magistrates, from the level of the Chief Justice moving down up to the prosecutors of cases. They're all involved in rotational trainings, and it's always like almost every 3 months they're trained. Within our police service training manual, we have integrated training around gender-based violence, what the role of the police should be and how they can respond, and we are seeing that has really changed. In Kenya, we have gender desks at all police stations. Our challenge is whether they're manned or not, but we feel it's good gesture that just that the police desk is available and it is there. We have paralegals at community level who are trained on gender-based violence and the linkage with HIV and AIDS. We also have quite a number of male involvement initiatives, identification of men as champions of change, as agents of change, specifically around gender-based violence. Something recent that has come up is we're using sports. It's not recent, it has always been, but now it's being hyped up. How do we encourage the youth to use sports and pass on messages around gender-based violence, anti-gender-based violence, so that we can be able to have a youth that also addresses that. Something else that we've been doing in Kenya is, around the challenges, I think something I forgot to say was issues around the conflict. And as my colleagues said before, women and girls with disability, in the event of any form of conflict, they're the most disadvantaged. Even getting them to move from point A to B is always a challenge. But now the government has gender-based violence technical working groups And in each technical working group is a member of a representation from a woman living with a disability or a man living with a disability and HIV. So in the event of any form of we need to transfer people, then we are clear where they are, who they are, and we ensure that they have follow-up on their treatment and other services that have been provided at that level. So something else we are doing is the development of one-stop centers that provide integrated healthcare services. And the integration will mean both gender-based violence services, HIV-related services, psychological services, counseling services, any form of service that the people will need. And for the children, after they undergo psychosocial support, there's also schools. There are also teachers who come and volunteer and ensure that the child disruption to the school education system is not too large. So we also have that kind of integration in those services. This is a photo of one of the one-stop centers that we have. We also have community sensitization, and as I mentioned before, identification of champions at community level. We are strengthening our legal and justice systems, both the formal and the informal. We're working with the Council of Elders. We're working with the local alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that the community can resort to and that can solve some of these cases without necessarily laying too much pressure on the formal justice system. We're also looking at how to have early warning and protection during conflicts, before conflicts, and something we have done as a country, we've developed emergency guidelines for use to respond to HIV, and these have been passed by the government. They were developed with development partners, with people living with HIV, community members. It was all stakeholders. We now call them shareholders. All shareholders were included in the development of those guidelines. We also have social support programs, for example, the cash transfers, that look at how do we, one of the before we were using cash transfers and giving only vulnerable children, vulnerable people, but now also people who've gone through any form of gender-based violence are recipients of cash transfers. So we feel that's good. Around the same issue, we have also invested and continuing to invest in economically empowering women and girls so that they can be able to have a right to property, right to inheritance. We're educating them on their property and inheritance rights as women and girls so that they can be able to own and have the right to make decisions about their sexuality, make decisions about anything that relates to their lives. Then, of course, lastly, we have, which is very important, we are recommending and supporting the government to implement most of the policies in place. We have very good policies. We have a challenge with the implementation, but many partners are together just to support the government implement all these good policies that they have, from the Constitution all the way down, including the gender-based violence policy that we have that has integrated HIV and AIDS. So yes, I think I'll end my presentation there, but also just for reference, WHO and UNAIDS has published a document in the last year, 2013, on 16 ideas for addressing violence against women in the context of HIV and AIDS. And I think it's a good document that each of us can read. It's basically programming recommendations that we can use on addressing violence against women in the context of HIV. Thank you very much.